Hi everyone, and welcome to this real-time tutorial showing you how to paint the inside of a French bulldog's ear. But this really is a tutorial about any type of ear that stands up. You get lots of different dog breeds with this type of ear, also cats, horses, lots of different animals. So hopefully this will give you the basics to tackle all of those. Hope you enjoy this. If you haven't already, please do subscribe here on YouTube. And also consider checking me out over on Patreon, where the guys supporting me there are making all of my videos possible. But I hope you learn lots from this. Enjoy the video. So let's make a start with the ear. You can see that I've got a faint gradient on the background already. So when I'm coming in with the edges of the ear like this, I'm really overlapping the background. You can see that the background comes in over the edges of the ear. And this gets me my lovely sharp contrast between the edge of the ear and whatever the background might be that I want to really set the animal off against. So this is Grey 27, a very yellowy white tint. And you can see that around the edge of the ear is really picking up the light. So just picking out the overall shape of the ear. With a smooth coated dog like this, I can afford to not worry too much about the little individual hairs at the beginning. I can come back and soften this edge even more. But for now, that just picks out the outline for me to get going. Now with some Grey 36, a really deep brown. And you can see it's perfect colour for those darker areas of the dog's ear. And I start coming in now just in the direction of the fur that I can see around the edges of the ear. Like with everything, I'm trying to think of the darker colours first. And I want some of these dark marks to show through my next layers. So I'm not leaning very heavily, I'm not filling the paper, really lightly scuffling the pastel onto the paper. And that's really key if you're using the bigger, softer pastels. Try not to lean too heavily. I want some pigment on the paper, and with the dark, soft pastels, you get so much pigment, so you don't need to lean very heavily. You can, of course, come back in and lean heavily where you want a really definite mark or where you want to make it really dark later on. But for areas like this, I'm just softly brushing the pigment onto the paper. I used Velour pastel paper for this project. But if I were working on pastel mat or any of the other papers that I've worked on or tried before, this would be the same method for me. So a couple of times in the video I'm going to speed us up a little bit just to get through an area with a lot of repetition. So continuing on with this dark brown. You can see that I've left the main gap in the centre of the ear. I'm going to be coming in with some lovely pink tones. And you can see that each layer I've applied, I've given it a good rub into the paper. It's softened the marks a lot, but that's fine for the early layers. My next layers of colour will add more definition. I'm just starting to feather some lighter colours from the tip of the ear down into the dark area. But the main thing I need to get blocked in next is all of that area of pink. So coming in with a darker pink, just starting to filter in some of that warmth in the center of the ear. And again, looking for the areas in the pink section that are the darkest. Not being too particular at this stage with my marks. Still many layers to go, so my top marks I'll pay a lot more attention. But right now I'm just trying to block in whilst also thinking a little bit about the texture. Starting to add some of those pink marks up through the darker area. Thinking of that fleshy pink skin as it shines through some of the hairs inside the ear. And one of the few areas that I've used pure white in this portrait, simply because the direction of light is coming from the dog's left side. And I really want this tip of the ear to stand out from the background. And just feathering some little marks into the darker area so that it's not a harsh line that I'm applying. I can get that outer edge of the ear nice and crisp against the background. But then I'll want to feather that edge into the rest of the ear a little bit. I can come back in with my darker colours, of course. Add to that dappled effect in the furry areas. The key thing when you're working with soft pastel is to build up your layers gradually. So working in thin layers, you can build up many layers to give it that extra depth. That's why I love pastel for pet portraits especially. The multi-layered effect really works well for fur especially. So my pinks are getting lighter. I'm starting to work them up into the dark areas, gradient that area a little bit between the light and the dark. Also trying to be a little random with my mark making, so I'm not letting it get too uniformed at any point. When I'm adding those little marks, I'm trying to have a sense of randomness about them. If you start adding your marks all neatly beside each other, you'll find very quickly that it'll not look like realistic fur. So using that lighter pink just to pick out some of the highlighted areas. So making use of the smaller pieces of pastel. It's a bigger stick that is broken or worn down. This one looks like it has broken. And I use those smaller pieces, just always turning them around, trying to find a sharp edge. If you're new to the big pastel sticks, it does take a little bit of time just to get a feel for having them in your hands And it's also quite scary if you've got a lovely brand new set of pastels. The thought of breaking them or wearing them down into these smaller pebbles doesn't seem that appealing when they look so pretty in the box. But really they become their most useful when you start to wear them down, get them broken and messy. So bringing in a little bit of warm yellow earth, one of my brown earths. This colour appears a lot in this dog's coat, but it's only really hinted at in the ear. You can see also that I'm working on the ear on the right. I've decided in this video just to focus on one ear as it makes for a shorter video. But I will just mention quickly that you'll notice as the other ear builds up, my highlight colours aren't quite as bright over there. If you have a look at the photo reference, the lighting is coming from the left side of the dog, and it's not quite as bright over on the other ear, so I want to make sure that if I want to capture that lighting in a 3D realistic way, I've got to pay attention to where the brightest highlights are. So both ears aren't exactly the same. I'm saving the brightest highlights for this ear on the left. So really feathering those pinks and light peachy pinks up into the rest of the ear. You can see that the first dark marks that I laid down with the deep brown, I can still see those through the next layers. And it's really the marks that I've made with the lighter colours that shape the whole effect. Well, just a tricky little area of the ear here, where there are little folds of skin behind other areas of the ear. And with each dog breed and with each animal, they'll all have their own little quirks that you've got to look out for. But the same thing applies for me each time I tackle a different type of ear. Looking for those darker marks underneath. Usually finding the nice crisp outline of the ear first of all. And then, like with every other subject matter, working from dark to light. And you can see that the more layers of these small marks that I build up, the more depth and realism starts to come. So the first bit of pastel pencil, I'm using sort of mid-tone brown from Faber Castell. I use a lot of Faber Castels. I also like Carbothellos. Any of the pencil varieties that are on the softer end of the spectrum. I find those tend to mix really nicely with the soft pastel. So I use the pencil just to strengthen any of the dark marks that I want to shine through a little bit more. So just in this lip to the left of the ear, there's a little bit of shadow cast. And of course, the point of the pencil is great for getting those very fine hairs. But there's nothing quite like the soft pastel sticks for getting real strength of pigment when you need it. So like here, especially with highlight colours, you'll often struggle to get a light pastel pencil to create really strong pigmented highlights. And I'm always relying on my soft pastel sticks for those. Of course, I can lightly shape things from the other side. You can always use your background colours to shape the subject matter that you're working on, to neaten up areas. It's such a versatile medium. It lets you work at something. It's why I'm quite rubbish at acrylics and not really fast enough for watercolours. I find those mediums much less forgiving, and I liken pastel to oil painting in a way because you have lots of time, you have lots of opportunity to add more layers. And as long as you're using a good pastel paper, a surface that's made for pastel, you should be able to build up many layers before you fill the paper. So if you're finding that happens to you, that everything tends to get muddy and the tooth of the paper becomes full, make sure firstly that you're using a good pastel paper that allows the application of many layers. And if you are, then perhaps think about how heavily you're applying the pigment. Could you apply your layers a little bit thinner? So a place I definitely make use of the pastel pencil, just in the very finest hairy lines that I want to create. But you'll also see from my technique that I don't go in for absolutely every little speck being in the right place. I'm not 100% photorealistic, not by any stretch. So I get an area to a certain level of finished. It might not be exactly like the photo, but if I get the feel for it and the lighting right, then I'm happy to move on. But I often spend quite a long time on the first ear because I'm usually figuring out the palette for the rest of the dog. The first ear is often a lot of decisions being made. So this is an area that I often put a lot of thought and work into the ears. I tend to work from the top of the piece down most of the time where possible. There are a few good reasons for doing that in pastel. Of course, you're not leaning on what you've already worked, so you're not smudging your work. I also find with pet portraits especially, it tends to follow the pattern nicely of how the fur gets layered up. So as you come down the face, the fur layers up quite naturally when you're moving in that direction. So it's starting to take shape now, just minor alterations left. Trying to lessen how harsh that outline of the ear is a little, just feathering some of those marks into the darker area. Each time giving them a little rub into the paper. You can see that just helps soften the mark into the layers underneath. And I would do exactly the same on pastel matte paper, and especially on pastel matte paper because you've got a little bit more work to do on that paper to make it look soft. So I'm constantly blending and softening the layers together. So in with my absolute brightest pink here. It's a really light tint. And I've got lots of these lighter colours. If you're struggling for your highlights to look realistic, make sure that you've got lots of lighter tones in all sorts of different tints. So from this really warm coloured tint with pink tint to it, right through to blues and greens. You want a whole spectrum of lighter colours for your highlights. So I certainly don't want to bring any white into the mix in the centre of the ear. It's just going to kill all of the pink and the warmth. So try to remember to limit your use of white, pure white, as a highlight colour or as a colour to make an area lighter. So I'm reasonably happy at this stage with how the ear is looking. I would almost be ready to move on and start work on the dog's face at this stage. You've also got to remember when you're working on the ears, if you're working on them first, they are going to look rather odd sticking up there on their own. So it does get to a point where you just need to move on, start getting the rest of the dog blocked in. You might later on see some alterations that you need to make. But to me, these are pretty close to being at the finished stage. If you're interested in seeing other parts of this project come together, I have my full catalogue of real-time tutorials available on my Patreon channel. I'll add a link in the description below. There you'll get a huge range of this style of tutorial based on all sorts of different subject matters. But I hope that you've enjoyed this one and that you'll have a look around the rest of my playlists on my YouTube channel. I have lots of free content there. And at this point, I'm really just looking at the photo reference, trying to compare the two. And it's mainly just down to finishing touches. The last thing being bringing some of those lovely little feathery hairs up at the base of the ear. So once I've got my highlight colour behind that, you can see how nicely those brown hairs stand out. And that's it for the inside of an ear. I hope that's been really helpful. Do let me know in the comments if there are any other shorter projects like this that you'd like help with. Until next time, happy pasteling.